Welcome to the Interchange Symposium's XChange podcast, where artists, activists, and entrepreneurs with different ideas and perspectives come together and address multiple topics and provoke thoughtful dialogue. Today's topic, Standing Rock. The long-standing protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline construction near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation have perhaps seen their most turbulent days come to an end. With help from the new Trump administration, Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the 1,100-mile-long pipeline project, is moving ahead with the last phase of construction, the controversial stretch running under the Missouri River near the Sioux tribal lands. Construction was halted in the summer of 2016 when camps were established in protest, citing concerns for the environment and for the protection of the sacred tribal sites. As of this episode, the main camp, Ocheti-Sac-Cowin, has been evacuated and construction is back underway. However, this hasn't stopped the broader protests and resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, or DAPL, and there are a lot of factors that play into why. The DAPL protests are just the most recent example of a long and contentious history between the federal government and native tribes that extends back to the establishment of the first British colonies. In December, the Army Corps of Engineers, under pressure from the Obama administration, denied Energy Transfer Partners a required easement to continue building under the Missouri River, temporarily halting construction while they explored options to reroute the pipeline. However, the new Trump administration was quick to reverse that move. Only 4 days into office, President Trump signed an executive order to allow the Dakota Access Pipeline construction to continue as planned. Interchange held a dialogue at Blunderbuss the day after the executive order was signed to discuss the deeper issues at play. For an issue this diverse and complicated, we brought together perspectives from tribal members, energy industry professionals, activists, and law enforcement to hash out the major issues and confusions that don't always make the evening news. First up is Darren Old Coyote, a former Crow tribal chairman.
One thing they wanted to protect was their water, and that's a constant theme throughout that whole council, was to protect the water, to protect their people. And they were talking about how these non-tribal members were bringing in, marijuana, and they're just kind of making a whole party out of it.
Next up is Chuck Peck, an energy industry veteran who has spent most of his career in oil and gas.
Now, I don't think that pipeline should be completed along its present route, but I think that this issue is being taken over by other people for their own agenda. If they want to shut down the building of pipelines in general, for example.
For some public policy perspective, we have Brent Mead of the Montana Policy Institute.
When we talk about tribal sovereignty, really the only issue area in which everyone is on board with, you're self-governing, you can have your own laws, are when we start talking about sinful activities. Casinos, cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes. That's it. Otherwise, sovereignty only goes so far as the federal agency wants it to go.
Brian Gootkin, the sheriff of Gallatin County, Montana, helped us see things from a law enforcement point of view.
Well, you're supposed to be a peace officer. And yes, absolutely, we are supposed to be a peace officer, but we're also supposed to enforce the law. And there's a balance. And we get stuck in the middle. And believe me, I raised my hand. I took my oath of office. But what happens is we have to know what that balance is. And sometimes that balance gets out of whack.
Next up is Meg Singer, the Indigenous Justice Outreach Coordinator for the ACLU and a member of the Navajo Nation.
Martin Luther King wrote about the phenomenon of urban riots and how they have a place when you're protesting. Because when you're talking about the only thing that is important to the people that are in power, which is property, then as soon as you make that sacred, you've lost all your power.
As someone familiar with the roles that communication and public relations play on this issue, Jessica Sena, a communications advisor with the Montana Petroleum Association, joined us to talk about that relationship.
Companies are expected and held to a standard where they have to operate with complete transparency, disclose a number of different information. And so it's just that again, I mean, so much of this, I think, comes down to differing worldviews and how these different sovereign nations interact, and having the federal government as that intermediary between either private development or tribal lands. I think, I mean, it's not a black and white process at all.
After Jessica, we have Jesse Barney, a proponent of renewable energy and activist who has been to Standing Rock.
The reason I became an activist and decided to go help Standing Rock stand was this is 500 years of wrongdoing. People are drawing a line in the sand, and it's about time.
Rounding out the panel is Katie Segura, a local organizer and activist who has also seen the DAPL protest firsthand.
As a Indigenous woman, my experience with cops, like if, just putting it into perspective, like if the March on Washington, the Women's March on Washington, was met with the same police brutality that Standing Rock was met with, which were both peaceful protests led by women, there would be way different headlines out right now.
To begin, we asked Darren Old Coyote to give us a sense of the treaty history between the native tribes and the federal government.
For the Crow tribe, I could, kind of explain treaties from that perspective. 1825 was the first treaty we had with the U.S. government, where it was basically a friendship treaty, where they shook hands and said, we're going to be friends as long as the water flows and sun rises or whatever. But 1851. Fort Laramie Treaty, they had a treaty where the Crows were asked, where's your home located? And this was the first time they were asked, identify your homelands. The chief at the time, Sitsimino Land, said the 4 base posts of my home is where my land is. One post sits at Popochaj, which is Popoagie River down in Wyoming, land of Wyoming. Sinks Canyon National or State Park, I guess. Second pole sits at Oshalachula, which is Three Forks. Third pole sits at where the Big River and Elk River meet, which is the Yellowstone, Missouri, and Williston, North Dakota. Fourth pole sits at the Big Saddle and the Black Hills, which is between today Balfouge and Deadwood. That was Crow country, as identified by our chief. And in 1868, all of Wyoming was taken away, basically for settlers. So the Wyoming line was established, and the Yellowstone River was the northern boundary. And the first Crow agency sits outside of Livingston. You drive by it every time you head to Billings, right off the interstate. The first Crow agency sits there. So every time the treaty, from the Friendship Treaty, the next treaty was, identify your land. Once we did, the next treaty was, we're going to take some of your land away. From, over 50 million acres to 38 to down to today 2 million acres. We're living at the third agency, which was established in 1884. The second agency sits at south of Columbus in Absaroka. And so that's where the second agency sits. Third agency is where Crow Agency sits today. So kind of, treaties for Crows. And in those treaties was education would be free, health care. They would provide blacksmith. They would provide every month rations. They would provide ox to plow. They would provide 5 head of cattle to each head of household. And even today, health care, a lot of people say Indians get free health care. I believe our health care is prepaid because of all the lands we've given up to the U.S. government. So it's not free, but it's not adequate. Our education isn't free. A lot of students that come to Bozeman or Missoula or everywhere else, we have to pay for our tuition. We have to pay. So education isn't free. So a lot of those promises made in the treaties aren't kept by the U.S. government. As a matter of fact, over 500 treaties were made. Only maybe a handful were ratified by Congress. And 51 and 68 treaty were both ratified. I did see the original treaty, which was made on goat hide at the archives. The 68 treaty, has a lot more goods that were supposed to be given to Crows, and each male was to receive 5 head of cattle and then an ox for farming, and farming with all those promises were never kept.
With the federal government no longer abiding by the original terms of the treaties, it set a historical precedent for how the government would view the extent of tribal sovereignty in future deals. Brent Mead had this to add.
Basically starting in the 1870s, when settlers found gold in the Black Hills. The 68 Treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, which is, essentially all of western South Dakota. Any land west of the Missouri River was part of the reservation. It extended up into North Dakota, going to the intersection of Cannonball and the Missouri. That changed in the 1870s. General Custer led an expedition to the Black Hills and found gold. And part of the 68 Treaty was that to get any change to the reservation, you needed 3/4 of the vote of the male natives. So in order to do these changes, the U.S. Army basically sent in people to round up the votes. They used coercive tactics, which when it came up to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1980s, they said it was a great shame that we did. So this all happened, but when the states were going to enter in 1889, in February of 1889, the U.S. Congress passed the Statehood Acts, saying that 9 months from the effective date of this act, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana will become states enter into the Union. In March of that year, they passed what was the Sioux Bill, which broke up the Great Sioux Reservation into the 5 or 6 reservations we have today. And a large part of that, it busted up the South Dakota ones. Now, the problem that we've had that drew the case to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1980s and a previous one in the 1940s was when a state enters the Union, they enter on equal footing. It's a complicated legal question, but there just really isn't a vehicle other than the federal government reimbursing the tribes. And that's something that we wrestle with today. It leads to a lot of animosity. I grew up on the North Dakota border. It leads to a lot of animosity in these areas because there's just not a good vehicle to go back, recognize the wrong that was done, find a way to rectify it without violating those statehood acts. And frankly, the solution that was reached in the 1980s was imperfect. It was the federal government said, yeah, we took your land, we didn't give you just compensation, we'll give you $100 million, and then that interest is going to accrue, which the tribes never accepted that money, so now I think that those payments are sitting on about $1 billion. But the tribes won't take it because that's an acknowledgement that, okay, this is a fair legal settlement. Okay. And I don't think the tribes agree with that.
That brings up one more key legal issue, the 1823 Supreme Court decision in Johnson versus McIntosh. The decision in that case ruled that private citizens could not buy lands from natives. Only the federal government had that right. And that the U.S. government had inherited British right of preemption over the native inhabitants and the right to extinguish the right of occupancy of the natives. Here's Chuck Peck on that ruling.
I read the first Supreme Court decision I've ever read in my life, and it was the one that kind of settled Native American law, land law, and that recognized that discovery caused that current situation. It was not written in an unsympathetic manner. However, it was written in such a manner that indicated we can't go back from this. And it's a really interesting document.
Yeah, so he's talking about Johnson v. McIntosh, which was 1823 with the Cherokee Nation. So this basically was saying, this was the first policy or law that ever happened in America. And basically, the United States was trying to figure out what Native nations, what relationship they should have with America. And the only thing that they could come up with was saying that Native nations were a ward to the state. That's the best idea of what they could have. And so that was based completely on racial superiority. They weren't European, they weren't Christian. And so everything since then has been the United States coming in and kind of proselytizing to American Indians, be it changing their religion, influencing their policy, influencing their government, but basically having this white savior approach of, look, this is how we do it, this is how you should do it, without any recognition of our own autonomy or sovereignty.
The Supreme Court case was brought to the Supreme Court from a lower court, and that lower court said it is unnecessary to show that they are not citizens in the ordinary sense of that term, since they are destitute of the most essential rights which belong to that character. They are of the class who are said by jurists not to be citizens, but perpetual inhabitants with diminutive rights. Shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's even more shocking when we're talking about Standing Rock, any of the issues that we have. We're not treated as native to nation. We're through the Department of the Interior. We're literally in with the flora and the fauna. And so, how dehumanizing is that? To put a 560 some odd nations, even more than that, and put them in with flowers and deer.
And listed after them, too.
Yeah. And even that isn't respected, because with the issue of Standing Rock, when you bring up the idea of the environment and trying to save the environment, that's not important.
The precedent cited in the Johnson v. McIntosh case predates even the founding of our country and dates back to an old-standing papal bull known as the Discovery Doctrine. Meg Singer explains.
The doctrine of discovery is a papal bull from the 15th century that basically said that all Christian nations who go out into the world and find non-Christian nations could claim that land as their own. So this was huge for, obviously, Roman Catholic countries like Spain, France, Holland, even England. So when the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the English came to America, when they discovered, in quotations, discovered the land, it also gave them the right that the land had been set apart for them. And so that doctrine is actually a foundational principle to federal Indian law.
A major concern with the construction was the risk that it posed to destroying tribal burial grounds and archaeological sites. The permit process is intended to assess the risk and mitigate it, but there's a lot of worry from the tribes that this is not done properly and that their sacred sites are being willfully ignored and irreparably harmed. Darren Old Coyote put it this way.
Historic Preservation Act was 1966, and I think basically a lot of the grave robbing that took place in that time, was to protect a lot of the preservation. But in Standing Rock, there's, how the whole, I guess the chairman kind of going through the law enforcement was that they were desecrating human remains, and that's what sparked, everything to where it is now. And that's when I started kind of following Standing Rock, where, and I even made a trip out there because U.S. government was basically picking and choosing how to, because we were in a fight out with a coal port that we were working on, and they said treaty rights was, that's how they got rid of the project. But in this case, Standing Rock was, there's treaty rights, but they were picking and choosing. The Army Corps was picking and choosing how they were going to use their treaty rights. That's why I stood with Standing Rock at the time.
The Historic Preservation Act calls for a review of available information to determine if historic sites or artifacts could be affected by construction projects. This is where a clash of cultures really starts to show itself. Much Native history is still passed down orally, so the locations of sacred sites isn't always going to be found in recorded information. That information is often shared through ceremonies and oral histories, not all of which are easily accessible from the outside. The U.S. legal system just doesn't account for this.
The federal government, the way that the that's set up with our sovereignty is they're supposed to be on our side. They're supposed to take our side. But one of the greatest lawyers in Montana, Gail Small, said at an EPA meeting, we are spending all of our time and money suing the federal government because they're not holding their end of the deal.
Can you define sovereignty?
Yeah, this is a sovereignty of basically Native nations have their own right, inherent right, to make and follow their own laws and to enforce those laws. You know, we get sovereignty because Congress granted us our sovereignty. That is how it actually works. So the federal government is supposed to be on our side in instances like this.
And that's Congress doesn't have anyone's best interest except for Congress's interest. I worked there for 5 years. Like, believe me, Congress takes care of itself. So yeah, I mean, that's always been the struggle. I mean, when we talk about tribal sovereignty, I mean, really the only issue area in which everyone is on board with, yeah, you're self-governing, you can have your own laws, are when we start talking about sinful activities. Casinos, cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes. Like, that's it. Otherwise, yeah, sovereignty only goes so far as the federal agency wants it to go.
Well, under the under the National Historic Preservation Act, you know, federal agencies are mandated to consult with affected parties, and they may be tried, but they are not mandated or required to conform to whatever their recommendation is. So they can sit there as the referee between, we'll say, the oil company and tribes, and the tribes will make a recommendation. The federal agencies aren't required under that to actually agree with it. I'll tell you, just having sat in these meetings, that they do tend to favor, and really promote the worldview of the tribe to everyone that's in that room. And it's very difficult when you have people they want to preach the Western science, they want to talk about the letter of the law, they want to operate in the black and white and do things the way they do on either private land or even other multiple use federal land. I mean, it's a different world.
With the executive order from President Trump clearing the way for the Dakota Access Pipeline, we wanted to know, is the oil at least going to be sold and used domestically, or are we risking a major pipeline spill just to sell it overseas? Brent Mead gave us the rundown.
The easiest way to think of Dakota Access is it's UPS service for an oil contract. So they're taking the oil that's drilled in the Bakken. They don't own that oil. They just have a shipping contract to deliver it to Illinois. From Illinois, it will most likely go south down to the Texas Gulf facilities, to the refineries down there. But that's one of the misconceptions, I think. Dakota Access is not an oil company. It's a transportation company at its core. And that's important to note. Now, I know they have all kinds of financial ties out there, too. That's the nature of large businesses, but it's a shipping contract. It's not ownership of the oil.
In fact, most oil transportation pipeline companies are just that. They ship oil, they ship natural gas. They often structure themselves in such a way that most of their profits have to go to their shareholders, so they're almost utility-like in fashion. And there are about 200,000 miles of large diameter pipeline crisscrossing. That's just the large diameter pipeline. There are millions of miles of distribution network and so forth, all over Bozeman, all over the whole country.
There's 2.6 million miles of pipeline across the country, 60,000 miles of crude oil pipeline. It's how 70% of crude moves. And for that region in particular, and that oil is being produced, whether they move it by train, whether they move by truck, this pipeline or a different pipeline. And only since within the last 10 years, has the number one source of transportation become pipeline because of the new pipelines that they've built. And prior to that, certainly still about 30% moves out of North Dakota by rail. Everyone's aware of those issues.
Where's it going though? Where's this one specifically
will go to Petoka,
going?
Illinois. And have the capacity. And
so it'll be sold to Americans, or where's it going to go?
Well, that's a good question. We still import twice as much oil as we export. We've only recently been allowed to export crude, but we're a country that uses 7 billion gallons of oil. We're the largest consumer of oil in the world. I can't tell you what the contract is. I don't know. I don't know the company personally, but from the Gulf states, it had the capacity to be exported. But I think that the goal of this country and probably this president is to ensure that we become energy independent, that what we produce here, we use here. And I mean, that America First mentality is probably, we're going to see that in the policies that are soon to come, I believe.
What are the? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so after we traded messages yesterday, I mean, I looked up, so on the investor material, that if you were to invest in Energy Transfer Partners, for this project, they state that it will stay domestic. The problem, I mean, with that, the export ban was lifted in December by Congress. Oil is a global commodity. So in some big picture fashion, it doesn't matter. The price of oil is set globally, and it doesn't matter where we get it from. We're going to be paying the same price. But if you go to be an investor in Energy Transfer Partners, in those materials they do say it will 100% will stay domestic, for whatever that's worth.
Even if the oil will stay domestic, there's still the looming risk of a major oil spill that could affect drinking water for millions of people along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. According to an October of 2016 Associated Press report, there were nearly 300 oil pipeline spills from 2012 to 2013 in North Dakota alone that were not disclosed to the public. The cause of the spills, however, is not always known, and may be due to old and outdated infrastructure that isn't as safe as the technology used in drilling today. Brent Mead made the case that the problem is often antiquated designs and materials, and that the pipelines being built today don't carry the same risks.
Pipeline spills happen. We had one under the Yellowstone River a few years ago, and I would throw out there that a major factor for this is about 45% of our pipelines were built more than 50 years ago. In some cases, we're talking cast iron pipe that was laid in the 1940s. So the advantage, I think, of projects like the Dakota Access is that you're going to be taking some of that aging infrastructure offline and replacing with the best available technology. It should be safer. Nothing is 100% guaranteed. But that pipeline that broke around Billings, I mean, that was old. It was 45, 50 years old. So at some point in time, we do need to replace this infrastructure because it is dangerous. That's why we do have spills. And we do need to replace it.
What happens in 45, 50 years on this one?
Well,
We'll be making everything out of hemp. We won't.
yeah.
But like you mentioned, so it's the worst thing to have to say shit happens with pipelines. But we have accidents in every industry, in every sector, and every one of those either brings to light some new regulation that's needed. In fact, that's why we have so many regulations that we do. I mean, the Pipes Act was strengthened. There have been several new pipeline acts very recently passed, but this particular pipeline was so interesting. I don't think people realize how technical they are. I mean, it has pressure and temperature sensors throughout the pipeline. They're required to do a mechanical integrity test before they ever put any fluid in it. They are monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in real time. There are automatic shut-off valves. There's information disclosed to local personnel just in case they would have to respond to that. I mean, so we are so much further ahead of the game now than certainly we were when these old pipelines were put into place. And I think a lot of companies will probably want to retrofit old lines with new lines using the best available technology. And so this is where I think industry is wondering right now, has a precedent been set when it comes to permitting a project? I mean, will the rules change because of this, or will they just change when operating adjacent to a tribe? So, I mean, like you mentioned, I think the technology is pretty amazing. I think the energy industry is one of the most high-tech industries, and we don't think of it that way because it's so old, unfortunately.
When faced with the prospect of having to replace an aging oil infrastructure, this raises the question of investing in renewable energy sources. With all of the inherent risks and costs in fossil fuels, why aren't we focused more on renewable options? Chuck Peck weighed in.
Poorer countries have more incentive to use renewables than we do. Because they don't have as much infrastructure. So you see a lot of solar going into remote places and providing electricity now.
Portugal is one of the poorest countries in the European Union. and yet they were able to run everything for more than 100 days off of just renewable energy. So, I mean, it's hard to say what the stakeholders in the oil industry is going to do, but the people have spoken. The people who are behind Standing Rock are divesting from, companies that are putting more money into oil companies, Wells Fargo. People want to see the change. They don't want to see their environment. As Montanans, it is in our Constitution to ensure that our future generations have a healthful environment.
Does everybody feel that way?
No, I think that most people feel that way, but it's a matter of practical use that, say you buy an electric car and you plug it in. The average electric car that's plugged in the average electric source, that's 1/3 coal, 1/3 natural gas, 20% nuclear energy, 8% hydro, and maybe 6% wind and solar. This past year, for the first time, the additions to the electric grid were dominated by renewable energy. Solar and wind power became the greater than natural gas for new power generation, but it's still a very small part of overall power generation in this country, and almost nothing with transportation. And again, when you plug in your electric car, you're plugging into coal and natural gas.
I think that there's too much money and interest tied up with fossil fuel, and I think it's beneficial to support research and design on, renewable energy sources. But as an Indigenous person from South America, I just want to make it extremely clear that that comes with class. So, like, in order to go out there and get a Prius or go to buy your food at the co-op or, like, support these things, like, it's completely a class issue that's tied up with that. And also, if you look at the mining of, like, rare earth minerals and silica extraction, those affect, like, tons of Indigenous people around the world, too. So it's like, it's happening from all fronts. It's not just one front. These pipelines are going through South America, too. There's like the Amazon River, in some parts you can throw a lighter in it and it will catch on fire. Like, so with thinking about research and design with renewable energy, I think it's like, it's a way to cut your dependency off of fossil fuels, but at what cost?
And that's I'm glad that was said, because when we think of renewable energy, we forget that it's not dependent. You don't create renewable energy with renewable infrastructure. Finite materials are used, mined metals, the transportation. I mean, have you ever seen a turbine blade moved by electric means? It's moved on a diesel-powered train or on a diesel-powered semi. And so there's a huge interdependence. Even in Germany, which has been a leader in green energy, has begun rebuilding coal-fired plants because they realized they needed to have a backup power source. So when you have that R&D and you're looking at storage and capacity and being able to solve those intermittency issues, I mean, they go hand in hand. We know that there are finite oil and gas, even coal reserves in the ground, but our projections on when we might run out of that or what might happen to the world have been false up until this point. And it's like when we continue to push the envelope and put it in the hands of the American people, that ingenuity and innovation, it continues to break through different barriers that we never knew were possible. The same thing can be true for renewable energy. When you hear pundits and politicians talking about all of the above, people like myself and others who've been involved with fossil fuels for over 150 years say, well, what about the below ground too? You need us as well. I mean, there's very much an interdependence, and it may shift, but projections of our use by 2040 still anticipate we are going to keep using oil, whether it's for petrochemicals, which are 6,000 consumer products, or other means. I mean, even if we got rid of all transportation uses for fuel, the petrochemical industry would find other uses for what we're drilling today.
And I think along with that, like bringing it back to the class issue, is that the people that are closest to the struggle are going to be closest to the solution. So I think bringing those people to these tables and having them have a voice is needs to happen.
And ask what kind of energy source they want. We're America goes into other countries and constantly trying to help, and what we may be subjecting them to, whether it's a costly renewable project that might not function, or a fossil fuel project that they just don't want. I mean, I think that's something to be considered, because we assume that they might want something, but energy poverty is a very real thing. High cost of renewables in certain countries, in certain areas, disenfranchises the poor, and I mean that's. The cost issue is huge too.
There's something else that safer pipelines lead to. A safer way to ultimately produce the 6,000 plus products that come from the petrochemical industry. If we approach this from the perspective of getting away from oil entirely, we'd be forgetting about all the ways we still rely on the industry that go beyond the gas pump. Our world is populated with plastics, polymers, and other materials that make modern life possible, even prolong and enhance it. Jessica Sena zooms the conversation out for a bigger picture.
So we think in many terms of this oil as like a life-sucking source that we have to get rid of. But it is actually a life-giving material used in things that do save lives routinely that we could not live without, whether it's the oxygen tubing in a hospital room, whether it's lifesavers parachutes, or there's 6,000 consumer products made from things that we drill, that we extract from the ground, oil and natural gas. And so, if nothing else, I think there's a huge amount of education that's needed on that, because we just think of it in terms of what we put in our tank and or what we think or hear about causing problems in different communities. But I mean, there's a reason that we use as much oil as we do. And I don't think, in talking to people, that many people are as aware of how ubiquitous it is in our everyday lives. I really don't.
The debate over abandoning fossil fuels gets more complicated when you consider all of the other costs in switching energy sources. Jesse Barney, an advocate for developing a hemp industry, proposed that a source like hemp, which is also clashing with the federal government, could strike that balance between energy needs and supporting tribal sovereignty.
Hemp is an amazing plant, and the oils that come from hemp are amazing, and the research I've done has shown that anything you can make from petroleum, you can make from hemp. And that's just the oil side of it. You can separate the fiber and the oil, and now you have fibers that you can make almost wood products out of. You can build a house, you can build a car, you can make cosmetics, you can make any plastic. Anything you can make with oil, you can make with hemp. And the amount of oil that you can pull out of hemp is ridiculous, and the speed at which it grows. I mean, in a good climate, you'll get 10-foot hemp plants in 3 months, and you have 100 acres of that, and you've got a lot of material, and it'll regenerate every 3 months.
Brent, do you think that'll ever happen? I mean, somebody that works with policy, there's got to be lobbyists, there's got to be a lot of noise around this.
I mean, the major question, and I mean, frankly, I'll start by saying the reason in my mind why we're still on fossil fuels is they provide the cheapest, most portable, most reliable source of energy. Bottom line. We try and bring other energy sources online, and they all have drawbacks because everyone is aware of the externalities with fossil fuels. It's not a mystery. So when we're talking hemp, I mean, my question is, I haven't done a lot of research on it. I would wonder, what are the input costs, energy input costs? So for, a set quantity of hemp, what are we looking to draw out in energy? Because right now we know what that is with fossil fuels, and it's pretty high. I mean, it's like, that's why we use them.
And my question is, what would you say, the hemp industry? Is that what it would be called?
If there becomes one, there isn't one, right?
The hemp
That's part of the cannabis
people. The hemp people. How can they support tribal sovereignty? Even though they're not members of the tribe or part of Native nations, how can they use their, privilege and capital to highlight issues that Native people are fighting? Because we're not even to that plane yet where we can talk about alternative methods. We're trying to fight for our water and our lives. Standing Rock isn't just about oil. This is about 500 years of oppression, and that's really what it comes down to. So how can the hemp do that?
Well, you have to back up a little bit. There is no hemp industry.
We need to get one.
There's a cannabis industry, which is a whole different thing. Hemp is a non-psychoactive plant that's not a drug at all and is literally just fiber and oil. So you're right, this isn't really a discussion about hemp and oil and all of that. But very quickly, hemp is sort of on the same side because the federal government outlawed it 100 years ago. And because of that, I mean, before that, there was a huge burgeoning hemp industry in America. But 100 years of not doing it, there's no infrastructure. So, and to Brent's point, it's going to be very expensive to get going at first because there are no refineries, there are no factories, there's nothing.
This episode was supported by Blunderbuss, an artist, activist, and entrepreneur's makerspace in Bozeman, Montana, and the creative home of Interchange. The debate over renewable energy still has a long way to go, but there's the more pressing issue of the real human cost of the Dakota Access protests. Even though the peaceful actions and the daily prayer ceremonies at the road blockade have been overshadowed in the media by the few violent clashes, isn't there a cause for concern that some people are there to intentionally drum up a confrontation with police? Could there be a smaller group of more provocative activists out there trying to bring attention to the standoff by instigating those clashes? Meg Singer observed what some of that interaction with law enforcement looked like firsthand.
This is where historical amnesia comes in.
Great.
Okay?
Well, not great.
This is the idea that if of a group that has been oppressed so much, the only option they have is peaceful protest. We look at Gandhi, we look at Martin Luther King, we look at them as like our ideals. Martin Luther King wrote about the phenomenon of urban riots and how they have a place when you're protesting. Because when you're talking about the only thing that is important to the people that are in power, which is property, then as soon as you make that sacred, you've lost all your power. So ideally, yes, your rights are peaceful protest. Yes, of course. But I think for a lot of people, they were very, very angry. What I saw, they were angry, but they were on public land. But they were angry, and so then the response was, we're going to arrest you, which I saw. I recorded it. I was legal observing. They were on public land. But because they were angry, because they were shouting, they were arrested. The same thing happened in Ferguson. Public land, on the street, and then ACLU has to file injunctions because of police brutality, because of the response. So really, it's not about what is better or not. This is our reality now. When you have people who care more about a pipeline than you care about little children or tribal sovereignty or ensuring that people are safe and have water.
Do you think?
Yeah,
do you
go
mind
ahead.
if I jump in?
Yeah.
Put the paddle up here in a minute. Sure. So I think a lot of people, I get the question a lot, well, you're supposed to be a peace officer, And yes, absolutely, we are supposed to be a peace officer, but we're also supposed to enforce the law. And there's a balance. And we get stuck in the middle. And believe me, I raised my hand. I took my oath of office. But what happens is we have to know what that balance is. And sometimes that balance gets out of whack because of emotions, because of hatred, because of, you name it. You have this, and again, I wasn't there, but from the outside looking in, you have this huge, it was almost like a perfect storm. And here are these law enforcement people in the middle of it. I'm not making excuses because I don't know whether they did things wrong, they did things right. But there's that line of they're there to keep the peace so that way the protesters don't get hurt by the private security people. But then there's also the laws that are getting broken that we have to enforce.
Have you ever read the book called Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates? He says that brutality, as we've seen in the media, isn't new, but the cameras that are recording it are. So I think that this is actual. I couldn't say that it was intentional, but I think that it's just showing how the world it actually is. When I was at Standing Rock, I saw cop run down a woman in his car, and she was running. And the only thing that I could think about was the women that had come before her, that had run away from the cavalry. Some of them didn't make it because they were getting, killed. But it's just like that idea that they don't even understand that could bring back that trauma. But showing it on, on Facebook Live or showing it on NBC, it brings it so that the mainstream people who don't think about what it means to be Indian in the 21st century actually have a glimpse of what it means. And everybody now that Trump is in power actually knows what it feels like to not ever be able to trust the system in which you're supposed to, be protected.
When an issue like this is framed in polar opposites, you're either for oil or against it. You're either with law enforcement or with the protesters. It's easy to lose the perspective that all sides have to meet in the middle before the discussion can even happen. Everyone has to be accountable before progress can be achieved. But given a lot of recent police history, from Ferguson to Charlotte to Tulsa, there is a widespread worry that law enforcement is not being held accountable for their actions. Videos of unarmed protesters in freezing weather getting hit with water cannons, pictures of bruises and cuts sustained from less than lethal munitions, and images of unarmed water protectors standing in front of police in full riot gear have circulated both social media and conventional TV coverage. With scenes like that playing on our screens, we asked Gallatin County Sheriff Brian Gootkin to offer us some insight for his field as to how law enforcement in North Dakota was doing and if we were getting the full story.
One of the first things we teach, and I'm going to talk mostly about my office and our deputy sheriffs. We teach our deputies, first thing is there are two sides to every story. And you treat everyone, I don't care who they are or what they're doing, with respect, the golden rule, period. So my answer to that, Tate, is I don't know because I was not there. So I am not going to badmouth the protesters. I'm not going to badmouth the law enforcement that were there because I don't know both sides of the story, except what we see in social media. And just like the internet, I don't think we can believe everything that's on there. So anyway, what I was going to say is one of the things that you say, if something like that happened here, one of the main reasons why I was going over there and I was not going to send my people over there, my deputies, without me being over there because of the mess that was going on over there. Plus, I know the sheriff over there, and if I was not comfortable with what was going on, I would be able to get my people and get them out of here, or at least voice my opinion to the leaders over there and say, time out. But I don't know what was going on over there. If something like that happened here, not necessarily Standing Rock, but anything, it could be a standoff, it can be protests about the Forest Service shutting down a firing range. I would need their help. And that was the whole reasoning. There's not enough law enforcement to take care of things by yourself. So when a huge event happens, we have to help one another. So that's my answer to that.
So why did you change your mind?
Two reasons. Well, and again, there was a lot of misinformation on Facebook and in the internet. We actually made it to Billings. But then the State Department of Emergency Services called me and said, the governor said that the interlocal agreement between North Dakota and Montana was only for the highway patrol, so we were not covered. So there was no way I was going to put our people over there and not have any type of liability coverage. It's just not safe.
Okay.
So we immediately came back, and that's when I had the huge amount of phone calls, emails, Facebook. I learned more about Facebook than I ever learned.
So they would have paid for the resources for you to go there.
North Dakota would have.
Okay.
Correct.
Go ahead, Katie.
So you're probably not going to like what I have to say, but I think that my experience with police officers and the DOJ system, working even from a lobbyist perspective to like being a frontlines activist, is that I think police officers are held to selective accountability, because if you ask 5 different people in this room, they're all going to tell you about the different experiences that they've had with cops. I think that everyone would have a different standard of accountability of what they expect from cops. as a Indigenous woman, my experience with cops, you know, like if, just putting it into perspective, like if the March on Washington, the Women's March on Washington, was met with the same police brutality that Standing Rock was met with, which were both peaceful protests led by women, there would be way different headlines out right now.
I would much rather have our deputy sheriffs protecting you than you dealing directly with private security who are hired guns, who have one thing and one thing only, and that is they're getting paid by somebody to make sure that, and they don't have any rules. We have rules. They're all laws that we have to abide by.
So last time I went out there, when I was at the front lines, we walked we walked up to the front, and there were like, I don't know, 100 cops dressed in riot gear, bully sticks, automatic rifles, a Bearcat, a sound cannon, and I was marching with my friend that had like a 5-month-old baby in her hands. And she was like, awesome, rad, Indigenous mom, doing her thing on the front lines. But like, people are bringing children. They're praying at the front lines. Like, elders are being marched up there by people supporting them to walk out there and pray. And we're met with that, like just the image coming up over the crest of the hill and being confronted with that. And you're holding water. Like, we weren't going up there armed, you know? Like, what, just experiencing that, it's like, what the hell, man?
What got it?
So what I would say to
what
that,
got it
without,
to that point? What got
without
it to the
being
point?
there, the only thing I would say is if that happened here, if we had that gear on, there's a reason why we had that gear on, and that's because something happened in order for us to have that gear on.
But don't certain police, so I remember reading in the news a while back, like, in order for departments to keep, like, their Bearcats, for instance, they have to use them, you know, every once in a while in order to justify the reason for keeping them. And I remember reading that, like, Bozeman once sent a Bearcat out to, like, a suicide call, and they had, like, a Bearcat out there. So do you think that just having that, like, what is the justification behind keeping that type of military property in a police department?
Sure. I would love to answer that. So number one, it's to save lives. And the call that you're talking about, we had a military veteran, and he called 911, and he said, I want your deputies to kill me. And the deputies were like, no, we're not going to go out there, and we're not going to confront you, we're not going to kill you. Okay, then I am going to start killing my neighbors, or I'm going to go to the mall and start shooting people. Then we have to engage. So then we start obviously negotiating with the person, but in the same time we have to get the houses cleared away from that house. We have to bring the Bearcat in because he absolutely is armed. We've seen him come out of the house with weapons. He actually came up to the Bearcat with the rifle, aimed it. We shot him with it's called a beanbag round. We didn't shoot him with a weapon. He got hurt, went back inside. You know, continued to try to negotiate with him. If we did not have that Bearcat, he would have been dead. We would have had to have killed him. But then later on that evening, unfortunately, he did kill himself. So.
Well, because with the use of the Bearcat, like bringing Bearcats out to Standing Rock, you know, from my instance, it's like there were two other instances that happened there, like when the guy brought in the loaded AR-15 into camp, and elders had talked him out into the river, and then through negotiation, simply just calming him down, he was like, all right, you know, I'm not going to shoot everyone. So do you think that police could maybe have like some sensitivity training on how to talk to people and meet them where they're at, rather than, you know, just maintain this like white heteropatriarchal lens that they're seeing the world through, and like getting some cultural relativity training or something? Like, is there something that can happen with both parties that can bring them to more of an even keel?
Yes. So there's crisis intervention training, which is one of those things that we train we train the entire state, which is somebody that's in crisis. I don't care if it's a veteran or just somebody that's, when I first started, you would go in and just try and kick butt and take them in, and now it is all about listening, talking, communicating, de-escalating, not taking them to jail, bringing them to the Hope House, bringing them someplace where they can get some help. And then, as a matter of fact, speaking of Judith, we did have training in Bozeman this week from the Department of Justice, I believe it was, on diversity training and trying to train the new law enforcement officers. It was a different world when I first started 23 years ago, but we absolutely are trying to adapt.
With so many conflicting and incomplete reports making their way around Facebook, Twitter, and the national news, it can be difficult to sort out what is accurate and what is not. We wanted to know, what did our panelists think was the most misunderstood part of the Standing Rock protests?
I sat with the chairman, sat with their elders, probably the first in their council, smoked their pipe. They were lost when I got there. The protesters were there. A lot of non-Indians were there, kind of leading the protest, and they were kind of being guided by people from the outside. But when we sat in that council, the one thing they wanted to protect was their water, and that's a constant theme throughout that whole council, was to protect the water, to protect their people. And they were talking about how these non-tribal members were bringing in, marijuana, and they're just kind of making a whole party out of it. That's what they didn't like, and I guess a lot of people, when the chairman, the council, and the elders, when they sat in that council, they said we got our language, our culture, our way of life, our water, our land. That's what's sacred to us, and we got to continue protecting that. And that was they were there to protect the water, the drinking water, for not only them today, but for the future. And the activists and the non-Indians kind of blew it out of proportion, where then the violence started coming in, because provoking the police officers, the Indians, if they just sat there and said that we want to protect it, I think the company would have went through. But to have the activists there was a help for Standing Rock as well, to protect the water.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I totally understand that question, but I'll answer it as best I can. I think that the issue has been turned into something a little bit greater. There was than it should be. There was an editorial in USA Today that was pro-pipeline, and it ended with, sometimes a pipeline is just a pipeline. Now, I don't think that pipeline should be completed along its present route, but I think that this issue is being taken over by other people for their own agenda. If they want to shut down the building of pipelines in general, for example. There are filmmakers out there who say, this is going to make my career. I don't think they really care about Native people. I think they care about their career. So I think it's generating a lot of topics that are completely peripheral to the main issue of Native sovereignty, whether that pipeline is going through an area of cultural artifacts, and the tribe's view on protecting their water supply. Those are the main issues of the pipeline, and that has been misdirected by the media and certain elements who want to talk about oil in general, for example. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I'm pretty close to that. And it's not just at Standing Rock. It's a broader issue with federal agencies that they will use tribal consultation as a means to justify a political decision. The example of the Washington coal terminal. They used the Lummi Nations treaty rights to justify shutting it down and ignored the Crows' economic treaty rights. Down in Utah, New Mexico, with the Barriers National Monument. There are certain branches of the Navajo Nation opposed to it. There are certain branches very supportive of it. But the decision that came down was only quoted those tribes that were in support of it. So it's this problem that it's not confined to one side of the spectrum or another, that a lot of groups use tribal treaty rights to justify a political decision that they want to make anyway. And I think that there needs to be a little more honesty in the process, and there needs to be some sort of teeth behind local consultation, behind tribal consultation, so that when these groups do disagree with a permitting decision, they're not only touted when that consultation agrees with the decision the agency would make anyway.
Me, the sheriff, if something happened here, I absolutely support peaceful protest. I would do everything in my power to make sure that they are protected, and I don't care which group it is. It doesn't matter which group it is. But when the social media aspect gets into it, and the misinformation that's on social media, and then you add the emotion onto that, that's when things can get out of control in a hurry. And that's when there's a lot of people that are not safe. And that's my biggest concern as the sheriff, is if that happened here. And my other thing is, and I wasn't there and I don't know, but if that did happen here, I want to meet with those tribal leaders face to face, because it's a lot easier to do things through the media and not get things done than it is to meet face to face and have honest, difficult conversations and try and work through them. So
I think for me, when we're talking about Native people, and with my work that I do, I work with Native people across all of Montana about civil rights issues. Something for me is just realizing that oppression isn't cognitive. I don't walk around going like, I'm oppressed because I'm a woman and I'm Native. But the reality is there. And so what I'm seeing with a lot of Native people is that they're actually able to have spaces and places where they are given voice to themselves, to each other, to their community. And what I don't like is seeing that space co-opted by non-Native people to fit an agenda. I think it's great if non-Native people go to Standing Rock and organize, but try organizing for Native people instead of on behalf of. So we have a huge community here in Bozeman of Native scholars, academics, people who are just waiting to get those relationships built so that they can take it a step further.
Jessica, sorry, I'm going to move to the side so I can see you.
Well, I think I told some of these other people that, I think the whole picture is, there are a lot of misrepresentations and a lot of confusion. I've watched from the outside. I haven't been out there. You can see in some videos protesters inciting violence, and you can see in other videos law enforcement being the ones to incite it. I mean, unfortunately, this has been, fortunately and unfortunately, this has been put into the spotlight, and groups have flocked to this location. And I've often asked, is it about oil? Is it about sacred ground? Is it about police brutality? It's coming in on the wake of a lot of fires that have been burning, whether it's an anti-police sentiment, an anti-law enforcement sentiment, an anti-mistreatment of minority group sentiment. And so you have all these different forces at work there. And then in the black and white world, what the company did, as a petroleum association, you're looking and you're like, did they do an environmental assessment? Did they follow the letter of the law? Did they check the boxes? And except for the question about whether or not the federal court's going to recognize the treaty, they checked the boxes. And the communication between the federal agencies and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office has left a lot of things unclear about how things are going to move forward. We know now that Trump wants to expedite the process one way or the other. He's directed the Corps of Civil Works and the Army Corps of Engineers to review and make a decision on that. So at the end of the day, I think if they look at the land now and where the pipeline is just a half a mile north of the reservation, say it's on federal lands, it runs along a natural gas pipeline, so we know an ethnographic study was done, then they will build it. I mean,
Would that still go over the Missouri River?
beneath it, yes,
Beneath it?
92 to 115 feet below. And the reason, I think, and a lot of the other misrepresentations is, I mean, this one pipeline crosses 22 rivers and streams along its entire route, and yet none of these other communities have people come forward. I mean, so there's.
But they have, though.
Let's,
Well,
let's,
Just haven't been
I'm gonna
represented.
I'm gonna open it up right after this, but let's get through Katie and Jesse, and then we'll kind of go through this one.
For me, I think the biggest misconception is they've been there since May, April,
Chetty has been
Chetty
since
since
August. It
August.
started in August.
So they've been there for 4 months, but the reality is all the flare-ups. There's been 2 or 3 major flare-ups where there was direct confrontation, and I think the misconception is those are the ones we see. We see these really dramatic moments, and those are the ones that burn into our minds. And I think that most people who haven't been there, I had this image before I went that it was a tumultuous sort of a place. And when I got there, the sense of peace and quiet and power and prayer that was over the entire area was dramatically different than what I had envisioned in my mind from what I had read on all sides. And so I felt like it was all bullshit. Yeah.
I would say the misconception of the media and how they covered it, I think that it means a lot of things for a lot of people. I think what Meg was talking about earlier with the oppression, like there's so many intersectionalities at play there. So, you have Indigenous folks talking about like all of the different things that they've been through. I think it was one of the best experiences for story sharing and sharing of just oral culture between different Indigenous peoples. So I think the misconception just comes in with the way that the media portrayed it. People were praying like every hour of the day. There were ceremonies going into the late night hours, and it was very peaceful at the front lines. Sometimes it got a little tense, but I don't think anywhere close to how the media, and if you look at the videos, just notice that the cameras are always behind the police. So that's just something to think about.
One thing that I would just say is for everybody is to advocate and create as much public education as you can on your rights. I was up at the legal tent the entire time doing intake forms, doing Know Your Rights trainings, and it was very touching to see so many people when you give them the thing, like here's what you say when the police tell you this. We were trying to. I had some people from New Zealand who came. They're Maori, and you have to tell them, if you get arrested, you have the possibility of being banned from this country, and they were like, that's fine. And I just literally broke down in tears and just hugged them, and I was just like, thank you so much for being here. If people actually knew their rights, they'd be more prepared to fight.
Of course, having this panel the day after President Trump signed an order to advance the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we had to address the elephant in the room. With the new administration, where's all this headed? So yesterday, Donald Trump placed an executive action to pursue the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access. What's the plan? What's
Why did it have to be yesterday before this?
What's on everybody's mind for actions they're going to take? What's going on?
Well, we all know that Donald Trump does things with great forethought and very careful not to offend anyone when he makes a proclamation. Sometimes I hate to find myself on the same side of the issue of someone that I despise personally. But I think that, personally, I think the pipeline should be rerouted and completed. I'm sure it'll be completed. And I would hate to see our president alienate himself from ever-increasing amounts of population with his heavy-handedness.
I think we're living in an illusion where we think that this wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump wasn't president. President Obama wanted this pipeline to go through. Hillary Clinton wanted Keystone to go through, advocated for TPP. Trump doesn't want the TPP. So that bodes well for Indigenous people. So really, when, like I said before, people are waking up to what it actually means to be an Indigenous in this country, welcome. It sucks. You cannot trust the system. Now it's even more of we have people, Donald Trump is appointing people who don't even believe in climate change to the EPA. That's kind of a bummer to try to work around people like that. But, the best thing that people can do is read and listen and talk about these issues with your families, with your friends. Create a dialogue.
From the law enforcement point of view, my concern is that now it'll be a federal law enforcement issue. So they'll bring the feds in. And I am here to tell you that, for the most part, we work really well with the federal law enforcement. But I would much rather have it be a local issue with local law enforcement who are I am directly accountable to the people of Gallatin County, obviously. But when you have feds come in that don't live there, they don't have their families there, they don't live in those communities, it's different.
I think clearly this is going to exacerbate the situation at Standing Rock because you have people that have dug their heels in. Evacuation order be damned, they were staying there. And now, the response will probably be different under this administration. I don't know. I think had Keystone been permitted, 3 or 4 years ago, whenever the State Department had found and concluded that it would not exacerbate our climate change problems. That was Obama's State Department that made that determination. Montana, it was not a partisan issue in Montana. We had congressional support from Republicans, from Democrats, from landowners in those small towns that saw this as a huge boon to their local economy. Now, though, because of the issue at Standing Rock, people are looking at pipelines in a much different way. That's going to be very close to Fort Peck Reservation. I think that stokes a whole nother fire. So I think it may be a challenge. Now the executive order directs the company to reapply. It's gone from what would have been a $4 million project to, I believe, or a $4 billion project to now an over 10, 11, $12 billion project. And so it's like, how are we going to look at future projects, or should we look at them through a different scope depending on which land or which people they affect? Or should we treat them all as, when I looked at this, I said, I don't want a pipeline to screw anybody. And yet the people that are advocating for this are the same that point to the administration that monitors pipelines and hazardous safety materials and says it's the safest way to move that crude. And it's being produced. And if we don't move it by pipeline, it's going to be put on a rail or put in trucks. A rail that'll cross a bridge that does, in fact, cross much closer to where the new water intake will be for Standing Rock. So, it's precedent setting in a lot of different ways, but there still remains a whole heck of a lot of uncertainty about how we're going to treat this type of development moving forward.
I like that. I like that there should be trepidation. I don't know why we just charge for it and do things and just so haphazardly we're going to make money and we're going to make plastic. And we're going to drive cars. It's just so asinine to not think a little bit more is there any other way that this is possible?
Well, if I didn't agree with that, I would never have agreed to come to this, It's like you can get home and live in the grail you want and ask myself these questions, but at the end of the day, there's going to be some discussions that lead to either some form of solution so that we know what will the process be moving forward. And the past administration had at least delayed the project long enough to say that further consultation is warranted and maybe mass reforms are needed for how companies, private development, for any type of development, deal with Indigenous people. So
Darren, what's next for you?
Well, I'm not surprised by the decision by Trump because basically, all the Dakota Access and Keystone, how Obama kind of set them aside, didn't do away with them completely, basically passed the buck to the next president, and now we're in a situation where Trump's going to have to come in and, regardless of what Standing Rock does or regardless of what Indian tribes do, we're going to move forward because we're going to make America great again. We're going to bring jobs. That's it's sad but true, and it's going to be another whole fight with Indian tribes and this administration.
Do you think there? I don't know. I talk to a lot of people, and they seem to think that the jobs aren't coming because of artificial intelligence and the rising machine.
I truly believe that. Even right now, a lot of, I guess we're a nation of hypocrites. We say we don't want global warming, but then yet we want to plug in our cell phones and our computers and turn on our lights, and we say we want to do away with these, but there's a demand for electronics. There's a demand for cell phones, iPhone 7, Galaxy 7, iPads, and all these. We plug them in. There's a demand for that, but still we want no more power plants, no more coal, no more oil, gas. We still drive our cars to work. We still jump on planes that have fuel. Our hypocrisy is why we're in this mess. If we did away with no electricity, no coal, I think the only ones that would survive would be the native people.
Yes. It would be a tiny handful of whites who would make it.
Anyone else?
Because you're probably a vegetarian and you can, huh?
Oh, yeah. You're on both of those things.
I mean, the bottom line with Trump's executive order, it's a political decision. It was a political decision when President Obama refused to give the state permit for Keystone. It was a political decision by President Obama to put a halt on construction. And that's been the core problem with this process is large infrastructure is difficult to do. And, MPI, we're all over the board. Like, landowner rights do get trampled in these projects. But at the same time, we still want to be able to ship that crude out. We still want to be able to get stuff off of the rails so that our ag products can get to market. So it's tough. But when that process is short-circuited by political decisions, this is the result. You're going to have, I don't think this is the last of the times when you're going to have a new administration reverse decisions on these kinds of projects, this kind of process, politically, and then come up with a justification after the fact. And something needs to change in that process so that the consultation process is more meaningful, that local stakeholders have more teeth to shut down over concerns, because right now it's entirely up to the decision-making agencies. They can ignore or accept that input and consultation as they want.
As we draw this episode to a close, we encourage you to comment on our page and start a dialogue in your community. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner. This episode was produced by Dylan Jesse, Justin Wayne, Susan Karstensen, and me, Tate Chamberlain. The music was provided by Nintendo and Debuda. Our panelists were Chuck Peck, Brian Gootkin, Meg Singer, Jessica Sena, Darren Old Coyote, Jesse Barney, KD Segura, and Brent Mead. This episode was supported by 10 Directions, Kian Ahern, Kyle Elliott, Robert Moore, Randy Henderson, Scott Lindahl, Hillary Renault, Heather Devine, Ken Fickler, Carol Chamberlain, Kim McKean, Ryan Johnsherd, Rich Rubisco, Timothy Tate, Tom Egelhoff, Roy Chapman, Ben Johnson, Jessup Sandoval, Pat Loken, Nakai Talon Hollowhorn, Jen Spencer, Joey Gove, Headframe Spirits, Sola Cafe, Zocalo, Homewood Sweets, Montucky Cold Snacks, and the Nova Cafe. A special thanks to our board of directors: Debbie Shank, D. Gregory Smith, Kia Abbey, Chad Urashak, Yara Craner, Jacob Desch, Justin Wayne, Dylan Jesse, Jessica Barley, and Tate Chamberlain. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Contact us at iaminterchange.org. That's iaminterchange.org.